Well, hello and a very good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Adrian Reed, and a very warm welcome to today's BA Community webinar, which is on a topic that is probably close to many of our hearts. It's one of those topics that absolutely should be built into the very fibre of our being in terms of practitioners of change, but certainly I found it's a topic that perhaps I didn't know enough about and I'm continuing to learn about. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity today and what a cybersecurity BA really does. Now, it's an open Q&A, so when we get started, you'll absolutely have the opportunity to add your questions into the Q&A panel. So I'd encourage you to do that as we go along. Do type your questions in the Q&A, and we will answer as many as we can as the conversation allows. Also, if you're attending live, feel free to use the chat functionality as well. If you put the questions in the Q&A section, that really helps me as moderator because I can differentiate them. But why not, if you're attending live, say where you're from, do a bit of sort of side networking with the people who are attending live as well. So I'm very pleased to say that we're joined today by Kevin Brennan, someone who really needs no introduction. Kevin's really got a very varied and broad history within the business analysis, business architecture, business change communities. Kevin, you were telling me just before we went live that you're just about to finish a master's, and I had to write this down because it sounded so interesting, in corporate innovation and entrepreneurship, which finishes in a few weeks' time. That sounds super interesting, Kevin. And also, of course, you were mentioning that you actually teach a cybersecurity session at a college in Toronto, which is fantastic. Plus, of course, you've had lots of notable publications in the business analysis world, and you have co-authored a book on digital product ownership. Is that the title? Digital product owner?
No, digital product management.
Oh, I knew I'd get that wrong, Kevin. I'm sorry. Which is out in August, published through BCS. So we'll put the link to that in the chat in a moment. So, Kevin, thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Adrian. I know this happened because I was doing a similar talk for a IIBA chapter here in North America, and a few people complained that it wasn't at a time convenient to the UK. So for those of you who were worried about that, here we are.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just before we get started, for those of you that are attending live, some of you will be familiar with this already, but there will be a mural board available for you to actually type your comments and your thoughts on, and it's kind of a form of collective note-taking. So as and when Kevin says something that you think is particularly interesting or something you want to take away, type it onto the mural board, and it's a form of collective note-taking. So we've got an artifact that we can all take away after the session. So I'm just going to pop the link to the mural board in the chat, and I'm going to very, very briefly share my screen and show you exactly how that will work. Let me just share my screen. There we go, over here. So when you type that link in, you won't need to log in or anything. I can see a few of you joining already, which is fantastic. And literally, you can just type your point in on a sticky note by double clicking. You can even be really creative by using different color stickies or images or whatever you want. So use it, be as creative you like on there, and I'll create a PDF after the session and we'll publish it. So let's get going. So do remember you can ask questions and we'll answer as many as we can as the conversation progresses. So Kevin, before we get on to the topic of cybersecurity, it's probably worth starting at first principles and asking the question that's probably very simple to ask, but I imagine quite complicated to answer, which is, what is cybersecurity? And adding on to that, how does it differ from, say, information security? Are they the same or are they different?
So I'm not sure if they are really that different from information security. Cybersecurity is essentially the work necessary to make sure that your systems are protected from intrusion. So that can lead to, you know, loss of confidential information. It can lead to systems being knocked out of order, right? It can mean that data is altered or changed. And right now, what we're seeing is that is becoming a huge threat to organizations everywhere. In Canada, for instance, a few months ago, there was a cybersecurity incident for one of the big airlines, not one of the big holiday airlines, right? So not the major place to place, but an airline that does, you know, travel destinations down at the Caribbean. And for about a week, they went offline and they couldn't fly passengers around, right? People were stuck down in the Dominican Republic, unable to get home. People were stuck in Canada, unable to get to their vacation spot. And it was just a complete mess and a public relations nightmare. And there seem to be more and more cybersecurity incidents popping up week after week that are having a huge negative effect on companies. Now, the worst case scenario, I guess, is something like what happened here on last Friday. So I don't know if you've heard about it, and it's not clear that this was a cybersecurity incident. It may have just been a random failure, but one of the major telecom companies, Rogers, went offline for about 2 days and knocked out about a third of Canada's internet, including mine.
Oh, wow.
And our cell phones and everything, right? And that's the kind of impact a cybersecurity incident can have. People couldn't call 911 because their phones didn't work anymore, right? We had banks were knocked offline, so we did all of everybody was unable to use debit cards, and here in Canada, debit is massive. I think that's true in the UK too, unlike, say, the United States, which is still more cash, right? But we've had a debit system in place for decades now. Everybody uses it for all sorts of things, and I mean, I don't even carry cash these days. I just use debit.
Yeah. So that's huge. I mean, and I mean, I did see the headline. I mean, I guess that shows how big a system outage it was, right? It crossed the Atlantic and was on the BBC News. And yeah, so interesting. And I suppose the other element to this, which is arguably as important or important from a different perspective, is you know, data breaches. Because not only is there the reputational damage, but in many jurisdictions, there are huge fines associated with that. And there was, for example, you know, we've had a major airline, you know, there's a major European airline that had a data breach, which resulted in, I think, one of the biggest fines that was ever issued. So you'd say it's about protecting systems, protecting data, protecting those sorts of assets, and presumably like intellectual property as well. I guess there are threat actors trying to steal state secrets and corporate secrets.
Yeah, and in fact, Apple, in their next release of the iOS operating system, is including a lockdown feature to protect people against extreme cybersecurity attacks, right? So this is not meant for, you or I. This is meant for, as I said, people who might be threatened by state actors, and it limits the phone's capabilities in quite a few ways, but it's designed to make it almost impossible for somebody to get any kind of malware or to hack into the phone with, in any way, shape, or form. It does that by cutting off things like, any graphics loading from the internet. You almost can't get online with it. It's very, very limited, but it is there for extreme cases.
Yeah. Interesting. So something that was striking me as you were saying that, Kevin, is I was thinking about some of the frauds that we hear about here in the UK, where individual consumers lose money, and there's like elements of social engineering in there, where actually sometimes not necessarily the weakest link in the chain, but an entry point is the person. And so does cybersecurity extend to the person in the chair as well as the system that the person in the chair is accessing?
Yeah, It absolutely does. That's where we start to get into what specifically cybersecurity in business analysis has to consider, right? Is the fact that in the end, most breaches occur because somebody does something they shouldn't, or provides information they shouldn't, or deliberately takes information, right? So for instance, if you remember back a couple of years when, Donald Trump blissfully briefly went offline because somebody had hacked Twitter, it turned out that him and a whole bunch of other famous people got hacked because somebody in Twitter had provided people with a administrative account where they could actually go in and modify people's accounts, right? And by accident, because they had managed to convince this person that they were in fact a Twitter admin.
Wow. Yeah. You see, it's interesting, isn't it? And I mean, again, a very a side note, but you kind of think about, I guess what might be called security hygiene. And one thing I find really interesting is often an outsider coming into an organization for a short period of time is, sometimes you can just walk around and the stuff that people leave on printers is I mean, obviously I have no interest in reading it, but you can find some interesting things on printers. So a friend told me, but I mean, you mentioned there that the role of business analysis and cybersecurity. So how would you say that they relate to one another? So I suspect a lot of people tuned in will be thinking about non-functional requirements, which is quite an important and traditional view, but it feels like this is something more than that. And is it specialized, or is it something we should all be aware of?
Well, I think it's something that most BAs should be aware of, but I'll just let me take things back a minute and sort of try to clear up, at least make some things a little clearer. So in cybersecurity, there's a role called a cybersecurity analyst. That is not a business analyst. I want to be clear about that. A cybersecurity analyst is somebody who is an expert in networks. They are able to probe the network for threats. They're able to, look at technical weaknesses. Now, you might have that skill as a BA, but that is not what that's not what I'm talking about when I say when I talk about how BAs should be thinking about cybersecurity. I would say the key thing to understand about cybersecurity for business analysts is that it is all risk management. Pretty much every piece of it that we are looking at is some version of risk management. And I don't mean simply issue tracking. Yeah. Right, which is a lot of what you see in projects around risk management. Risk management includes things like threat analysis. Who are the people who might try to penetrate our systems? What are the assets that we have that are valuable? What is the risk to the organization if those assets get altered or changed in some way? Right, and going down to things like, well, how do we build a business case? What is a reasonable investment in terms of cybersecurity safety? Because let's face it, no organization can be 100% secure. If you want to get to that level, you're going to have everybody in a radio frequency shielded environment, right? Where they cannot, where they physically must go in and use the computer. It has no outside access. At the kind of level that you see with the government, all right, and government state secrets. And even there, sometimes people get in and get information from them. Yeah. So it's always going to be some level of thinking about it and deciding what is a reasonable investment in that for our organization. So things like selecting the appropriate controls and then potentially assuring that this has all been done. Right, that these things are in place and that we are following the policies that have been set out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'll take our first question. So Matt asks, do you have any top tips for getting stakeholders to engage with and/or think about cybersecurity? And I suppose bringing this back to something you mentioned there about the business case, there's the amount that an organization probably should invest, and there's the amount that it's got the appetite to invest. And it might not be something that people particularly want to put the spotlight on. So any tips for just getting stakeholders to think about it?
Well, these days, I think sheer terror is becoming a major issue for a lot of these organizations, right? You're seeing increasing number of reports. I think it's going up I don't know what the numbers are in cybercrime over the last few years, but it is rapidly increasing. There are, as you mentioned, the fines, impact that can have in an organization, which will get people's attention when you remind them of how much risk there is actually at stake. And the closer these things hit to home, I think, the more that organizations tend to think about it, right? So if there are companies like yours that have been attacked, then you're going to have a much sharper focus on what that means, or you should. Another thing that's going to push people into it, though, is insurance. It's getting harder and harder to get cyber insurance, and they're getting more and more restrictive about what gets in place, and simply because of the amount of impact that these things can have, right? Because companies can be asked to pay millions of dollars in ransom money if they get hit by ransomware, for instance. Never mind the fines, never mind everything else.
Yeah, wasn't there a famous case a while back where I think was it Sony Pictures or one of the big movie production studios got hit with ransomware, which took down. I was listening to a podcast about it, and if what was said on the podcast is true, like it took everything down, and there were people sending faxes because like that was the only way they had to communicate, right? Everything went off. So,
and there was a huge leak of all the movies they were working on, emails and communications with various stars, right? Some of which those people would absolutely not have wanted public because they show people being, being people, right? But especially with the ego that a lot of celebrities have, they don't look good in it, right? Or they'd be having discussions about, James Bond and whether or not they should look for a non-white actor, and talking about people in unflattering terms. It was bad, right? That's the kind of thing that could happen in any company these days.
Yeah. So I'll take our next question, and apologies if I mispronounce your name. I do apologize. I think it's Noni or Noni asks, how do you overcome pushback from people who say a cybersecurity BA is not technical enough? So I suppose another way of springboarding from that question is how technical do we need to be to do business analysis with a cybersecurity lens? And how would you push back if someone was saying, look, you need to be really technical, you need to understand the firewall rules and whatever?
So I guess the question is, from my perspective, is what exactly are you? What is your role? I don't think most organizations yet, there are a few exceptions, but most organizations do not have dedicated cybersecurity BAs, right? I think it's far more common that we have to include cybersecurity concepts in our business analysis work. So if you're talking about somebody who's a dedicated full-time cybersecurity BA, I suspect that yes, that would be a case where you'd want to learn more about the technology and about the risks that particular technology poses. You could start with your business analysis skills and build on that, but you will end up needing to dive deeper into the systems and how they work. But if you're a BA who's working on a typical project, right? And you're doing BA work and you need to think about cybersecurity, I would say you actually don't need to be that technical. Most of the questions that you need to be asking are not about the hardware. They're not about the physical infrastructure. They are about the information and the business and the effect it would have on the business if certain scenarios were to occur. And as a result, what is the business going to do to prevent that? So you'd be looking, so from that sense, you can look at stuff from, and there's a tool in cybersecurity called the CIA triad, and it does not stand for, any kind of intelligence agency. Yep. It means confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So as a BA, I think it's very straightforward to be asking questions about what happens if this data confidentiality is violated? What are the consequences to us from a business perspective, from a reputational perspective, right? From a legal or regulatory perspective? Integrity, what can this information be modified in a way that causes fraud or causes us to have business losses? And of course, availability. What happens if the system stops working? What are we going to do about it? How long will it take for us to get a new system up and running, to avoid failure, right? What's our disaster recovery plan going to be? I mean, these are all things that I think you can raise as a business analyst in any context, because they are fundamentally business questions.
Yeah, yeah, and I like what you said, or one thing that really resonated there was about understanding the scenarios that could occur, and either how we're mitigating against them, or how would we respond, how would we respond if they were to occur. So having that disaster recovery, business continuity, all of these types of good things that really we ought to be doing anyway. This is stuff that is important from so many angles. So building on that, if you were to think, Kevin, about like concepts, tools, or techniques, are there any tools, techniques that we could use as BAs to help achieve a higher level of cybersecurity?
Sure. So on top of using the CIA triad as a lens, good tools or good starting places for a BA to look at are your concept model, your data model. You can go in there looking for, okay, what is what they call PII, personally identifiable information that we store about, say, our customers or clients or other parties, right? What do we have? And who should have access to that data? Do people really need it? Are there ways that we could anonymize it, right? To protect, what else could we do to protect that confidential information from getting out the door? Another tool that you should be using is the standard risk management tools, right? Looking at risks through various lenses like probability, severity, to try and categorize all of these potential risks and outcomes and determine which are the most urgent to deal with, which are the most pressing, which have the most potential effect. Business cases are a useful one. I know that a lot of people struggle with cybersecurity business cases for one very straightforward reason, which is that your traditional business case is about, we are doing X. If we build this thing, we will be able to do Y and make X amount of extra dollars, right? And in cybersecurity, to do a cybersecurity business case, you're looking at it kind of from the opposite angle. It's, okay, if we were hit by a cyber attack tomorrow on this system, it would cost us this amount. And so the avoidance of that loss is the ROI, right? It is. And by the way, I had to go to a finance professor to get this answer, and he said it was a little hard because the tools really aren't built around mitigating risk for business casing. They're really built around increasing profit. But that was the best answer he had, was that you start with your base case being a loss, right? And then you calculate the ROI based on, the amount of money you didn't lose.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I saw a fantastic presentation at the BBC conference by Bindu Chanavirappa and Tari Baresh around building a business case for cybersecurity. And one of the really interesting exercises they did is they said, well, what are your glasses worth? And the point being that that's when it kind of dawned on me that, well, actually, if I'm somewhere where I can't immediately get a replacement set of glasses and I'm driving, they're actually worth a huge amount because of the impact of having to do all this restoration work and repair work, and I've potentially lost business off the back of it. And it's kind of like that, isn't it? It's not just well, how much would it cost you to replace a hard drive? It's how are you going to mitigate the reputational damage of that data leaking, and the fact that you've had to stop operations for 2 months. So it's almost like a catastrophe plan in a way, or that catastrophization.
Right. Yeah, it's about avoiding that huge loss and that impact. Yeah, and I know Bindu and Terry have been involved in this space for a very long time, right? So, I'm sure they've been for quite a few of these exercises with stakeholders. But yes, there's that. The final thing that you can do, I think, that's important is there are various control frameworks out there, like NIST from the US government. I think there's ISO. And what they have available is a lengthy list of measures that you can take to increase the security of a particular system or organization, right? And there's a lot in there. There are literally hundreds of these things. But what you do with these is you go through it and you assess whether you consider something to be low, medium, or high risk, and then it will give you a recommendation as to which of these to follow. And again, as a BA, that is something that falls very much into what we do, right? Is reviewing these things as stakeholders, coming to an agreement on how big we see the risk as, and figuring out then, okay, from this list, which of these controls do we need to put in place?
Yeah, yeah. And actually that's interesting as well, because that also, as you were saying that, at the back of my mind, Kevin, I was thinking, there are certain categories of information which are classed as more sensitive than others, and some of which is common sense, like medical information, of course, is more sensitive than some other types. But there might, it's probably worth us as BAs maintaining awareness of all of this stuff, because certainly in, like, say, I believe in UK and European legislation, that like whether someone's a member of a trade union or a political party is actually classed in the same category as you would need to, if you were storing that, and you'd have to have a very good reason to store it, you'd have to put a very secure level of of security around that. So that risk assessment. So I'll just bring in a couple of questions here, because we've got questions coming in thick and fast, which is excellent. So Stevie asks, would a cybersecurity BA support with carrying out simulating cybersecurity attacks? So I'm guessing what Stevie's referring to there is sort of penetration testing and those sorts of activities.
So again, potentially, if you have the right skill set for it, right? I don't. I couldn't do a penetration test myself. So, I certainly wouldn't be involved in that. But if you do have the technical background to be doing more technical cybersecurity work, absolutely. However, there are other kinds of simulation that you might get more involved in. You mentioned penetration testing, right? But sometimes they do social engineering as in these kind of things. They will sometimes do physical testing. If you ever want to feel uncomfortable, spend a little time on Google and start looking at some of the talks about physical security. For instance, you will discover that most door locks can be defeated in a matter of seconds by somebody with minimal training and the right equipment, which is easily accessible. In North America, for many, many years, there was a standard police vehicle that every police department used, the Crown Vic. It's now being phased out in a lot of places, but you can go on to Amazon, and if you search for Ford Fleet keys, you will find a key that will open almost every police car in North America.
Wow.
And let you drive off of it. Yeah. So, these are the kind of things that. So this kind of social attack is definitely something BAs can get involved in. Another might actually be preparing for a cyber incident. So helping the decision makers figure out, okay, say there was a cyber attack. What do we do? Who gets involved? Who do we make a phone call to, right? Because the time you don't want to be figuring this out is when, your systems are all down and people are yelling at your customer service reps. You want to have a plan in place, and that's an area where I think a BA might actually get involved.
Yeah, I was thinking similar along that almost scenario analysis on, if this happens, this is how we respond. And I always think of situations like that, like being a pilot in a cockpit, and I gather that they have checklists for just about everything in there, because if smoke's filling the cabin, the last thing you want to be thinking about is, what do I do when smoke fills the cabin? You want to know exactly which buttons to press in which order, because you're going to be quite stressed. And if you've just had a data breach and the media are on the phone to you telling you you've had a data breach because you didn't know, you're going to be quite stressed. So actually having that checklist of, this is what we do to secure the perimeter and get the comms out there. So we've got a couple of questions around training or qualifications in this area, so I'll bundle these together. So we have an anonymous question, which is there any cybersecurity related training or qualifications you could recommend for BAs? And then Suhas, I think I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Suhas mentions that he's a lead BA, part functional, part technical. He's taking up cybersecurity and wondered if there are any specific skills to develop alongside the study that they're doing. So any advice on training qualifications and skills alongside trainings and training qualifications?
Well, I know IIBA has its cybersecurity business analysis, which is, I think, which fundamentally is about, the fundamental skill sets that you would, that fundamental knowledge that a BA would typically have going into this situation, right? So it gives you a background in cybersecurity. It is something that is probably useful to show that you have awareness of cybersecurity. It's not the kind of thing that is going to get you into the into a full-time cybersecurity job, however, right? The ISC, I think, is the one that has what, as far as I'm aware, is the kind of leading North American, well, at least in North America, the CISSP is by far and away the most popular cybersecurity specialist designation. But to get that, you have to be working in cybersecurity for 5 years, and it is fairly expensive to obtain and maintain. But if that's, there are also other ones like people who do COVID, ISACA, I think. They have ones that are oriented towards risk management, and which would be appropriate for a more senior level kind of discussion around what the overall risk appetite is and how the organization wants to deal in risk in general.
Yeah, fantastic.
And ISC is actually starting an entry-level cybersecurity certification. I think it's very new, but ISC's reputation probably means that it will be well accepted if you're trying to get into actually doing cybersecurity work.
Yeah, definitely. So picking up on a question that Stevie's asked, which is around how do you help people recognize individual responsibility for cybersecurity rather than it becoming just some overall general responsibility? But sort of adding to that and building on a theme, Kevin, that we've talked about, which is how can we get cybersecurity? How can we make it sort of something that we don't have to keep? How can we make it sort of build it into the fabric of our organizations without us having to continually push it? So building on what Stevie said there about actually getting people to take responsibility from it. And I know you mentioned about like the fear element, which I think is important, but also getting it sort of built into the fabric of organizations. Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has to happen is general frequent communication about it and reinforcement of the message, right? What are the risks? Why is it dangerous? Why do we care, right? What do we have that's at risk? And honestly, though, part of it means from a BA perspective, you have to think of it in terms of change management as well. So, don't just run out and throw down the highest security levels that you can imagine over everything, because if you over secure something, people will start to look for ways around it, right?
Yeah.
So they have to feel that security is appropriate to the problem that you're solving. So, we have companies that, a lot of companies have a monthly password change requirement, and, I bet 90% of their employees just take their previous password and add a number at the end. How is that more secure? It's not.
Yeah, absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. So that engagement then is also about understanding. It sounds to me like there's actually a huge human element of this, about understanding that people will try and get around stuff, and actually, because I can remember for years and years the recommendation was don't ever write your passwords down or store them anywhere, even in a password manager. And whereas now the recommendation from what I can take it from a lot of organizations is no, use a unique password for everything. And the only way you're going to remember that is by putting it into a secure password manager, but use a reputable one with zero knowledge encryption and all the rest of it, right? So, do your due diligence. So I guess to some extent, it's also about perhaps breaking away from accepted norms that have followed us for years or decades in some cases.
Yeah, it is about that, and I think it is primarily about understanding the human element of all of this, right? As I said before in this talk, most breaches occur as a result of some human action, right? There are ones that are purely technical in nature, but they are less common. it's most often somebody going to a website they shouldn't and downloading some ransomware, right? Or people viewing, people at your work who go to various questionable websites to watch things that you certainly shouldn't watch anywhere except the privacy of your own home, and getting ransomware installed on their machine and having it spread. I do have a story about this, which I think, the statute of limitations, as it were, has expired on, but quite a few years ago, this is before I got involved in IIBA, so we're talking, way back into, before times. I worked at a company that did, development and web hosting. And for Adrian, you're probably old enough to remember word macroviruses, right? When that was a thing.
Yep.
Where there's a vector of attack that involved putting programming into Microsoft Word documents or Excel documents. You open up the document. I mean, it still happens, but Microsoft has locked that stuff down a lot more than they did back at the time. And so, I was at work one day and suddenly got an email from, somebody in our IT department that supposedly included nude pictures of Anna Kournikova, who was a big tennis star at the time, right? And I'm like, okay, I don't even know this person. Oh, this is a virus, isn't it? And then I got another one, and before everything went down, I saw as far as I could tell, the first one had gone to our head of security, who opened it up. It went to the CEO, who opened it up, and then it went to everybody.
Wow.
And our email was down for 3 days, and I had a client who I was working with, so I went and worked from home, and I told the client that, oh, I can't use our corporate email because I'm at home. Because of course we were hosting their website, and if I said to them, hey, yeah, we just got taken down by word macrovirus, I don't think they'd have been continuing to host with us.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and I guess that shows how prolific these things can be, and how people can, and hopefully people are more aware of those types of attack vectors these days than perhaps, I think there was a time when everyone was a little bit more naive, and it's interesting because would you say there's that part of what VAs can do, or part of that role is around the informing stakeholders of the risk? It might not be entirely our job. There's normally other roles that can do that, but if we're rolling out information processing systems, which we normally are, right, we'll be doing processes, but there'll be IT elements of it. It's actually not just thinking about how the cybersecurity is implemented, but also how details of the common risks are actually communicated to the people so that they know to look out for them.
Right. Yeah. And how and where we give access to who needs access to specific data and why do they need that data, right? And looking at keeping that to the minimum necessary. If you're doing things like working on the data warehouse, you might include requirements around anonymizing data so that, if it does leak out, it doesn't matter because a particular piece of data can't be connected to a particular person. It's also important, honestly, to get diversity of views in this space. One lesson I learned some years ago, and I think has really stuck with me, is with a lot of new technology, one of the things you have to think about is how it could be used to stalk someone. Oh, right. And as a white guy of a certain age, I didn't really think about that until it was pointed out to me. But after it was like, oh, yeah, I can see a lot of cases where something can be used by, a violent or abusive person in ways that are highly dangerous. Seeing that with, tracking tools and tracking technology, right? There's been various social websites that have been turned into a danger because people could see when somebody was going to be at a particular restaurant based on their habits. Yeah. These are all these too fit into the kind of cybersecurity risks that we need to be thinking about on our teams. We have to be thinking about the different pressure, the different ways that our technology could be used or misused.
That's really interesting, Kevin, because that starts to come into the whole what could some of the unintended impacts of, and it comes back to, and It's funny. I think fundamentally one of the things that a piece of legislation like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union and the UK implementation of it, but elsewhere as well, has meant a lot of organizations have asked the question, should we even be storing this data in the first place? And I suppose a good way of not having data leak is just don't store it. You know, unless there's a genuine defensible reason, just don't store it.
Yeah, and I've seen that a lot with, say, credit card information, where companies have looked at the requirements around PCI DSS, which is the standard that governs credit card information, and just said, you know what, we won't keep credit cards.
Yeah,
we don't need that. We don't really need them, and the risk of having them is just too high. And it's similar for other kinds of data, right? If you don't need it, then don't get it.
Yeah.
You don't just gather everything you can in a person for whatever reason.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting coming back to the sort of these sorts of attacks. One of the things that happened very regularly for a period of time. So I used to, as you know, volunteer for IIBA UK chapter, and there was a time when I was president, and the finance director would get periodic emails spoofed, you know, because you can create a from address, you can put whatever from address you want in an email. Actually, now there are ways of, with DKIM and SPF and stuff, of at least minimally highlighting that. But it would be like, like, I need you to do a bank transfer. Tell me what details you need. And the first time it happened, I remember she texted me and said, have you sent me an email? This is really unusual. And when we were speaking later, she basically didn't say it in quite these words, but like she basically said, Adrian, I knew it wasn't you because you would never write an email that short. I mean, those weren't quite the words. She was much more polite than that. But there is also that point of, and then once we realized this was happening, we sent communication out saying, look, you know, this would never happen. Always authenticate through a more secure channel like SMS, like, you know, where there's at least some level of security, although SMS isn't perfect. And I suppose there's an element of also instilling that culture of security, that it's okay to ask, because if the person's request is genuine, they're probably not going to be annoyed. Or you're certainly not going to lose your job by asking. You might lose your job if you say yes to someone who's asking you to do something you shouldn't do. So I guess there's like helping to instill that cultural element as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen similar scams to the one you're talking about as well. At one company I worked for, I got an email that was supposedly from the CEO asking me to run out and buy some gift cards to give out to the team. And honestly, I was, in that company, it was not the CEO, it was a small company, so talking to the CEO is a pretty regular event. The only thing that gave it away was that there were a couple of grammatical errors, and it was like, wait, Rob doesn't write like that. And then I looked more closely, it's like, oh, that's not even his email account. Wait, and that's what clued me into it, right?
Yeah. And now through the company I work for, we get regular random invoice requests from companies we do no business with, and you'll see the URL is the domain is just slightly misspelt, so they're just trying their luck. But so I suppose there's an element of this as well as having secure procedures for things like accounts payable. So accounts payable check against purchase orders and check that there's actually been a requisition created. And
it is gonna get worse. I saw something pop up from David Smith about deepfakes, and one thing to be very aware of is AI voice technology is getting very, very good.
Oh, wow.
And it won't be that long before you could have a scenario where, it says, give me a call at number X, right? And it will sound like the person you know, because they're able to change that person's voice in real time. I don't think we're there yet, but it is something to be aware of for the future. We'll have to treat every kind of request like this, the way you would a bank credit card, where, if the bank sends you a message saying, hey, there's been credit card fraud, do not respond to the email, do not call the number, get out your credit card, look at the number it says to call the bank at, and call that number, right? And don't do anything and do not give that person any information unless, right, you call the bank number and you talk to somebody who's actually at the bank.
Yeah, yeah. And Terry says in the chat here, you know, spot on, verify, verify, verify. And again, this is making me think from a business analysis perspective in building processes where perhaps there's a challenge respond type situation to authenticate. So, you know, if I want to, if we need to have, if we need to exchange bank details on the phone, Kevin, and this is something we might need to do occasionally, I'll have some sort of challenge that I know only you will have the response to, whether that's a set of numbers and, you know, or it's just something that I know only you know type of thing. Great. So Terry also says in the chat, could you talk about the importance of managing code securely in a DevOps shop, including helping the team track vulnerabilities? A great place for BAs to have impact. Any thoughts on that, Kevin?
Honestly, I haven't been involved in that end of things, so my answer to Terry is unfortunately not. But if you know somebody else can, I think that would be perhaps a great topic to discuss at another time.
Yeah. So Terry, I think you're volunteering there to do a follow-up webinar on DevOps. No, I'm only joking, Terry. But if you do want to, do get in touch, of course. So we also have a question from Alicia, who says, how do you get C-level management engaged in cybersecurity risks? And I wonder with this, Kevin, whether that element of storytelling becomes important about well, look what happens if we don't think about this stuff.
Yeah, it does. But I think, honestly, that is not going to be as huge a problem in the future as perhaps it has been in the past. Boards are now asking for this kind of thing routinely. They want to see cybersecurity plans. They want to know, you know, because every board should have a risk management committee, right, as part of its standard operations, and cyber risk has to be part of that these days. And if your board has a cyber risk committee, they are asking your C-level executives what they are doing about cybersecurity. And your C-level executives will want to have an answer to that question, right? So in general, I think that is coming. It will be the norm. In the meantime, if you want to get to them, I think it is again about risk. It is about the potential downside of ignoring this stuff, the impact it could have, and on the reputation of the firm, on its performance, on its stock price, right? Which affects their bonus schedule, right? It is something that has a huge impact at that level, not just at the level at which we work.
Yeah, definitely. So Kevin, we're approaching the very end of our time together. And if you are attending live, do stay on, because there's a few other things I'd like to finish on just after we finish chatting to Kevin. But sort of in closing, Kevin, if you were to think about, 1, 2, or 3 key takeaways, things you'd really want BAs who are listening in on this conversation to take away, what would those takeaways be?
So I would say, I think, first of all, that, as BAs, think of cybersecurity as risk management. We have to take a much more active role in risk management than we have in the past. So it's no longer about issue tracking. It's about getting out there and investigating, exposing risks. The second, I think, would be that, let's see, sorry, let me pause for a second and remember what I was going to say second. Another one would be that, be very aware of the assets that are at risk in any given system, right? So what is the information that is being exposed, and how could it affect people, and how could it hurt someone? The third is to remember that there is a lot of material and support out there that will be useful to you when doing this kind of work. So I mentioned NIST. There are a few other such organizations that focus on cyber risk. They have a lot of tools and resources that you can go out there and get and use to do things like they will tell you questions to ask. They will tell you, common risks. They will tell you common measures that can be taken to adjust to those risks. So it's not like you're kind of trying to make all this stuff up on your own. There's a lot of material out there because this is a huge and growing problem. Fantastic.
So look at the resources, build on it, and then implement it and get it get it sort of implemented. So, Kevin, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. I'm absolutely sure people will want to stay in touch and keep up to date with what you're doing. How is the best way for people to follow you? Would that be LinkedIn or Twitter or elsewhere?
Yeah, so basically you can get in touch with me on LinkedIn. At Twitter, I am at BA Kevin, or I always can be reached by email at kevin@newba.com.
Fantastic, and I've just put them in the chat as well. And just before we finish, so do stay on if you are still attending live, because there's just a few more bonus things to let you know about. And the first thing I wanted to let people know about, Kevin, of course, is your book, or the book that you co-authored with Sally and Philip, is coming out on the 25th of August. Now, it's a different topic, but if you were to give like a 20 or 30-second overview of the book, what would it cover?
Well, the book is intended for BAs and project managers and other IT people who, we're assuming that you understand things like how to gather requirements, how to map processes, all this sort of stuff. But it's to help people who are now moving towards doing products. By products, we mean externally focused apps or websites or other tools that are used by customers or beneficiaries of the organization. And we're focusing on the techniques you need in order to be effective in that kind of role as a product manager, which is not a product owner. We do touch on that as well. A product owner is somebody who works with an agile team to prioritize what's important, the work that they're doing. A product manager has to look at the market and figure out what it is that customers actually need and want, which is somewhat different from what we're used to as a BA. As a BA, we're used to going out there. There's a finite number of stakeholders in most BA work, right? You could theoretically get a very good understanding of the domain and how they do things and what they do. With product, you're always guessing to some extent, and it is about working in that kind of uncertainty. I don't know if this is still the case, it's still available, but if you order from BCS, if you use Brennan as a code on checkout, I believe you may still be able to get a significant discount on the price of the book, and it will be out in the next, as a pre-order. I think it will be out it says there August 25th. So let's see, hopefully that is in fact the case, but I think we're on track for that.
Fantastic. And I can see lots of interesting stuff on the mural as well. So I will publish the mural after the session. Great. So excellent. Thank you very much, Kevin. Lots of insight. And for those of you attending live, or if you're watching the recording, this is the point where we'd be giving Kevin a round of applause. So of course, a virtual round of applause. But a great way of giving someone a virtual round of applause is to actually connect with them on LinkedIn, to follow them, and to engage with their their online writing, and of course their other writing as well. So just before you all go, another thing I wanted to let you know about, you may already be aware, but just in case you aren't, I wanted to let everyone know about BA Digest. I will put a link into the chat here. This is a quarterly PDF magazine about all things BA. It is completely free. You don't even have to subscribe. I mean, you can, and we'd love it if you did subscribe, and then you'll get it direct into your inbox. You can literally just click and download it as a PDF. I would love it if you're on this webinar, go ahead, download it, send it to your friends, and if you've got an internal corporate intranet, put it on there. It's a free open source resource. You can also view it online in a kind of flipbook format to give you a sense of what it's like. Of course, this will be slow because I'm using Zoom at the same time, but it's very interesting, a whole bunch of stuff in there. So do take a look at that. Also, next webinar next month is a little bit different. It's the BA Open Mic Night. If you haven't attended one of those before, take a look. It's the 25th of August, so coincidentally the same date that Kevin's book is being released. And essentially, it's an open forum. It isn't recorded, and anyone, maybe you or I or anyone, can take a 3-minute slot to talk about a topic of their choosing. So maybe you want to come in and talk about, cybersecurity or product management or agile or whatever, and then get like live responses and views on the questions that you ask. So do attend. But the thing about open mic is that it is not recorded. So you have to be there. And if you're not, if you miss it, you miss out. We'll then have further webinars in kind of October, November, and so on. So keep an eye out for those as well. So the only thing to say is, again, thank you very much, Kevin. Really, really interesting session. Lots of lovely comments in the chat saying how useful people have found it. And a massive thank you as well, of course, to everyone who has showed up live or who has watched the recording. So apologies if we didn't get to your question. I know there's a couple that we weren't able to cover. It's always time gets us on these sessions. So enjoy your evening or afternoon or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Until next time, bye for now. Thanks again and bye for now.